some of you know me from Superseal, so you might wonder what am I doing here with PMR22. We've got a holding company called Torrox. It's quite interesting if you've never heard of what a Torrox is, or if you've never heard of the legend of Richard Bull Smith. Just Google Richard Bull Smith. It's one of the most interesting stories and biggest property deals ever. Our mission is to support and simplify the process of major maintenance and repair for community schemes. So we've recently set up a company called the Painting and Decorating Association. I won't go into that today, but I'm here just to represent PMR22, and Superseal is obviously our contracting arm. What I'd like to accomplish as an outcome in terms of our speech is just a bit about the pre-planning. So you'll see on your left, you'll be able to follow where we are in the terms of the slides. We're going to discuss quite a bit about pre-planning because I think that's where a lot of you are. A lot of maintenance plans haven't been done, and then we'll briefly just touch on the adoption, implementation, review and reporting. Although this came out in October 2016, I think not all schemes have implemented the 10-year maintenance plan. And so then we'll look at a few practical scenarios. I see you guys have got sheets and you're going to mark me, so I'll try and make it interactive because that's one of the criteria. So some of those questions and scenarios we can discuss. There's 5 pre-planning questions, and that is, what should the trustees prepare their own plan? I think the reason some plans haven't happened is because initially trustees said, we're going to do our own. Why should we pay for anybody? Should they? And if not, why? Then if you want to appoint an agent or an expert to do it, how do you go about doing that? So just some practical legislative rules to make sure that you as managing agents are making that appointment correctly. What should they be contracted to do? How much should you spend on a plan? Because I think some say, well, I'm getting a quote for 17,000 and a quote for 6,000, what's the difference? Obviously there isn't standardization of plans, but the Act does put in place certain minimum criteria. So you can understand in terms of what you're getting and what you're paying for. And then what should you provide the planner with to make his job effective? So first of all, should trustees prepare their own plan? Now I'm going to say yes, they can, but they need to understand that there's a process that needs to go that's involved. Look at previous invoices. They can call in suppliers and contractors, building experts. So there's nothing to say that they can't do it. But the legislation uses a term called reasonably. And throughout all legislation, one has to understand when that term's used, that there's implications. And the implications are quite simple. If we look at the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act, first of all, the responsibility of the body corporate is to do all things with regard to management and administration that's reasonably necessary. Then in section 3.1a, when it talks about the administration fund and the reserve fund, again it says it must be reasonably sufficient. So there's a reason that that terminology is used, and one needs to understand that from a legal perspective, when we talk about reasonably, we say, well, what is an objective third party? In an arm's length transaction, what would a reasonable person have done? Now the problem with many schemes, as you know, is that people often want to spend as little as possible. They have contribution bias. If we give as little as contribution, we keep that money in our own bank account. And is that reasonable? So if you let the trustees do it, have they acted in that way? Because the body corporate must be able to justify the budgeted amounts on the basis of reasoned and costed estimates. So if there's significant expenditure, health and safety issues, a lift that needs to be replaced, whatever it may be, was it reasonable for them to say, no, it doesn't need to happen in the next 10 years, we'll only provide 100,000 for it? Have they costed it correctly? Did they apply their mind to the process? Because the recourse is obviously somebody could go to CSOS, and they could declare the amount as being unreasonable. So there is an onus on trustees that they give an unbiased, well-reasoned, and fairly accurately costed account. So if I ask the question, many of you would say, well, then it's probably not a good idea to leave it in the hands of those that will be paying the contributions, because there is that risk of having contribution bias and rather erring on the side of caution. So how do you go about appointing an expert then? Whether you choose PMR22 Plans or anybody else, the appointment needs to be done by resolution. And so that would be preferably be around robin. And in terms of that, it would be a written resolution. And you need to indicate in that resolution exactly what powers you're providing to them. So try and make that resolution as including all those specific areas. So then all the trustees have signed in terms of round robin, whatever method you use. And then to answer what the company should be contracted to do, we look at basically PMR22. And they have to assess the condition of the scheme's common property. So that's going to be by means of a rating. And the Act or the legislation doesn't say exactly how it should be rated. Every company might rate it slightly differently: poor, very poor, average, good, very good. But it needs to be rated. And then included in the rating is how long before work needs to be undertaken. And that all goes into terms of your plan. So basically there's two parts: assess the condition, put it into writing, and develop the plan. And so in terms of pre-planning, you need to specify what the scope of work should be. So if you're going to simply copy out the whole of PMR22 in the Act and say that's what we want you to do, then make sure that happens. But the plan also needs to be reviewed annually. Some management agents I deal with say, I definitely want you to sign a 3-year SLA with all my guys. Others say, no, just want a once-off cost, let them review it themselves annually. My recommendation is there's a lot involved. So sign a contract, a service level agreement, where you've got your scope of services, who's appointed, what powers they have, how they're going to be remunerated, and for how long. And preferably put a 3-year service level agreement in, but the cost of year 2 and year 3 is significantly lower than that initial inspection. And so if whoever you contract to do the work is coming up with the same price year after year, then you're not getting value for money. You need to ask what is you doing in those second years that justify it. Because obviously the initial inspection it involves quantifying how many windows, doors, the height of the building, really getting all the quantities there, and that takes time. Once that's in place, it becomes a lot easier in terms of the inspection. So to summarize, the steps to your first general meeting is you either do your own plan or you appoint an agent. If you appoint an agent, make sure you do it with a trustee resolution. There's a written service level agreement that has the minimum criteria in terms of legislation. All right, so how much should we spend on a plan? I've heard managing agents say they get 3 quotes or 2 quotes sometimes, and they're vastly different. Well, obviously it would depend on the footprint of the scheme, how many units there are, is your roof accessible, are the exclusive use areas in common property easily accessible. And yes, you've got to look at exclusive use areas. That technically is part of common property. We can discuss how that comes into the plan later in terms of questions. If they've got a lift or elevator, there's a lot more involved in that inspection. And in terms of the Act, we should be inspecting lifts and escalators, or elevators rather. Hopefully there's no schemes with escalators. That means gaining access to that lift room, checking the book that's been inspected, having to inspect the cages. There's quite a lot involved. What level of electrical and plumbing testing do you require? Do you have potential structural issues? So if the inspector is a structural engineer, that's fine. If he has to call in a third party, obviously that's going to increase costs. You will know if some schemes have structural issues. There are many schemes that have just been very badly built. There might be several waterproofing problems. So how do they sort that out? And then also, are they expected to calculate the reserve fund, or are you going to do that yourself? So those are important things to put in the scope of works. Some inspectors do have the ability to also help you with calculating the reserve fund, which is what we do. So what should you provide the planner with? Preferably you've all got a survey general sectional plan. So send him that at the very minimum. Talk about potential areas of concern. Some schemes may be debating should there be safety doors, or the walkways I've got problems because the soffits are leaking, or the pool pump keeps on breaking, or whatever it is. Let him know about those things so that we can spend time looking at it. And any items that are intended to be replaced. So windows are always an issue. You would come to a site and half the windows are wood and half are aluminium. What is the plan going forward? If improvements are considered, then they've got to be handled correctly first, because this plan is not about improvements. We know that's a completely separate matter, and that needs to be handled in the proper way in terms of special resolutions. But the trustees may well be talking about it, and so it may be prudent to handle that first, and then one can include it in terms of your reserve fund. And then what past contributions have already been made for the reserve fund, if you're wanting him to do that, that would be helpful. And I'll explain to you a little bit later why. So just coming back to this issue of improvements, as I said, the MRR plan is not intended for that. So improvements can't simply be adopted. And there again, one needs to realize maybe there's a manual gate and we want to put a key card electric gate system. Well, your plan is not going to know that it is an improvement. Have you adopted a special resolution to do that? So those little things, inform them about, but make sure that you give that notice of the meeting, that the exact wording of the resolution is in place, 75% vote in favour. Once that's done, I'll include it in the plan. You've got to let him know how to gain access to the site and find out if there's possible to have access inside the roof. That would be preferable so they can actually inspect the roof trusses, etc. Access on top of the roof, gain access to the room where the escalator or lift is. And then this is basically what an inspector would go, well, I'm very bad in knowing which is southwest and northwestern, so we go with a compass so that on the report I can actually indicate what's required. Most inspectors will always have a laser meter so you can check the heights on every part of the building and do proper measurements. We've got moisture meters which to check for moisture, rising damp, whatever's noticeable. Little testers that will inspect if there's electrical cable, if there's steel in a wall, because you can see potential spalling, things like that. So that should be in the box of tricks. We've got a nice little extension camera that gets you into areas that you can't get. So you're obviously going to go there with your step ladder, and you might have to go into culverts, because you can't always open your servitude doors and see what the pipes look like. So you've got a light with the camera, and all those sort of tools is what a good inspector would have and be able to take photos and put it in the report. In terms of levels, you can not just have a little spirit level to see if it's level here, but you want something that can go at least 100 meters to see the tarmac or the asphalt. Is it level? Where's the water running off to? Is there potential problems of pooling? Why is this part of the asphalt starting to lift? Is it because of water? Whatever. So there's a few other little things in this box of tricks, but make sure that whoever's doing the inspection is qualified and is using the proper tools so that the inspection is done well. And that's why I say, if the trustees are going to do it themselves, do they have this experience? If not, they should be calling somebody out that understands this. So what should the plan include? So, as you know, the administration fund talks about repairs and maintenance. And then PMR22 will, for the reserve fund, which is in terms of PMR24, talks about maintenance. But the difference is here, for PMR22, it's just the major capital items. So changing light bulbs, things like that, are not an issue. I mean, one of the trustees phoned me after I delivered a plan and said, our light fittings, we'd be wanting to replace, why haven't you included the light fittings in it? I said, well, nobody told you wanted to replace, there's nothing wrong with them. So in terms of you want to replace light fittings, that's fine. That can be considered a major capital item, but you need to inform them. If it looks like the light fittings are working, it's just aesthetically not pleasing, it's different. So again, I'm not going to go into all of this because I think you're very much familiar with what that part of the plan is about. I'm going to try and focus on things that maybe have escaped some of the people. So the definitions are contained in PMR21 of what PMR22 means. The definition of estimated cost is there. The definition of expected life is pretty much subjective, because you don't always know that gate motor is going to last 7 years or it might break in 3 years. So there's ways that one can sort of get an idea of how it's looking, test the remote, and then you make a subjective assessment. But it's not going to last longer than 7 years. That's the general life of it. So we may say, okay, this looks like it's been here for 3 or 4 years. We'll provide for another 3 or 4 years for that. The electric fencing, the bobbins look fine, but the energizer doesn't look so good. So let's provide for an energizer in 3 or 4 years. So that's what you do. But in terms of section PMR21I, it says that you need to look at the lighting and electrical systems, look at the plumbing, the drainage and the stormwater systems, the heating and the cooling systems, any lifts, any carpeting and furnishings, roofing, interior and exterior painting and waterproofing, communication and service supply systems, so your intercom systems, your security systems, parking facilities. When do you need to repaint the lines? Is the asphalt going to need to be replaced? So roadways and paved areas. Look at the paving. Is the compression underneath it fine? I was at a site the other day, and you can feel that the paving is hollow. So you need to point these problems out. You don't always know what the cause of it is, but the trustees need to be aware that there could be potential problems here, sagging, land, soil, whatever. Security systems, facilities, and other community and recreational facilities. So there it explains what major capital items are. So whoever you use for a plan, whether the trustees prepare their own plan, they need to know that that needs to be done. So now you can think, some of these could be quite expensive. We'll look at some scenarios. And then the last thing is past contribution. It means what funds are currently in the reserve fund. So maybe you have been collecting towards the next redec, and so there's already 350,000 there. Let us know about it, and then that also gets included in the fund. But there are some issues in the Act which don't make it practical, like this formula for past contributions. What they say is you need to do it for every single item. So you need to say, what is the estimated cost of the gate motor that needs to be replaced? How much have we put towards it? So it's not really practical. So what we do is, obviously on the redec, we would have a look at what has been put across and any other money that's been put away that can be put in the reserve fund. We would lump all the stuff together. And so in a practical way, what the Act wants you to do is they want to say, okay, like on a redec, we've put away 350,000, it's going to cost 850,000. So there's R500,000 rand that still needs to be collected over the next 5 years before we do the redec. So 1,000 rand, 100,000 a year needs to be collected for that purpose. Does that make sense? So it would be simpler. What we do is, in practice, we put all of this together, and you'll see at the bottom, we will indicate in terms of, I don't know if you can read that well. The red is the expenditure that's going to happen in that specific year, and then the yellow is the amount that is required escalating. And again, the Act doesn't provide for escalations. It's a mistake. I've spoken to the Ombudsman in Cape Town at CSOS. They acknowledge that there are errors in the Act, but they will wait for feedback from people. There isn't a panel at the moment that has been set up, but eventually a panel will be set up to relook at the legislation, and then there'll be a few amendments. But this problem of escalating, because now you start collecting funds, and the next AGM, you say no, it's going to escalate, and so you've got to re-adopt everything. Whereas if you provide for the escalation, so what we do with those green figures is we actually smooth the escalation of around about 5%, and then you can see if the expenditure happens, the yellow is what is left in the reserve fund, and we make sure that whatever's left doesn't go below those requirements in terms of the 15% and the 25% of administration fund and so on. And then you'll see on the left-hand side, there's a little green figure. I think it's 185. My eyesight's not so good there. That's what you should have in your reserve fund to start with. So we provide you with all that guidance so that it becomes far easier in terms of making sure that you comply with all legislation, and it's practical because it escalates. So once it's adopted, you can see exactly what should be spent in year 1, year 2, year 3, etc. And we don't have to keep on going back and changing things. So the way this is now what would typically be the third page of our plan. Our plan would obviously have some photographic reports of what we saw, the ratings on each of those parts of the building, and then on the third page, or sometimes it's the fourth page, depending on how much we observe, will be in one little outline, and that's essentially your plan. The plan now has been presented. You've been given it by your consultant. You now need to adopt the plan. So that's done by general meeting. It's adopted by majority vote at that general meeting. And the Act says in PMR22 that you also need to provide for an approval of such plan, and members may lay down conditions for the payment of money from the reserve fund. Now, what conditions could there be? Again, we need to apply our mind to this. So let me share you some scenarios. And please, it's difficult to rate me on interaction if you can't interact with me too. So think about some of these scenarios. Let's say scenario 1. An inebriated tenant backs into the wall of a shared exclusive use area. He absconds. The body corporate insurance contests the claim for damages. Expense is not catered for in the MRR plan. Can we take money out of the reserve fund? Let's think about that scenario. Scenario 2, the MRR plan provided for 850,000 for redec costs, but the trustees received 2 quotes for the cheapest at 980,000. Can they proceed to take funds from the reserve fund? We'd like to answer any of those scenarios.
I'd say yes, one answer is no.
Okay. Why no?
Well, because simply it's got nothing to do with the reserves.
Okay.
And S2, of course you can take the money, but you've got to get some more money for the members to pay the balance.
Okay, but can the trustees proceed to take the funds from the reserve fund? Okay, right. Let's look at some more scenarios. Storm damage to the common property roof, urgent repairs, waterproofing and resulting damage. The expense is not catered for in the MRR plan. Can the trustees proceed in that case to take money from the MRR plan? Scenario 4, a block erected in 1972 finds that the elevator suddenly stops working. Their service provider says that the mechanics will need to be replaced with modern parts. It's going to cost 320K. The off-fire escapes stairs, but the expense is not catered in the MRR plan. In these 2 scenarios, could we take money from, now we're not talking about, we're talking about money from the reserve fund. Can we just, so what would be the proviso to taking the money from the reserve fund? Just the trustees just take it. Anybody?
You haven't allowed for something in the plan because you didn't think about it. You know, there's swings and roundabouts. There might be something in the plan that you never use the money for.
Would you have to do something before? Would you have to provide 7 days notice? Call a meeting?
If the members have obviously given a directive to the trustees, they've given them a limit on the spend that they're allowed to for maintenance and that kind of stuff, then they would obviously have to get a special resolution or go get a general resolution through a general meeting. If there's a huge expense and it has already been approved by the members at a general meeting, then the trustees would have to just do a resolution between themselves in order to authorize that, if it's included in the maintenance plan, as far as I see it. If it's a complete different anomaly and nothing's being approved by the members for a huge spend like that, I don't think the trustees have the capacity to make that decision themselves, and they would have to go to a resolution for the members.
I would agree with you there. So it might be an emergency situation, like in the second case, they may decide that, or in the first case certainly, that they would need to take action, inform everybody about it. But that's why the conditions of the MRR plan is quite important, because the Act does provide in terms of how you can use money for other purposes, especially emergency purposes from the reserve fund. But it's better that when you adopt the plan, you have those conditions. So if we've provided to pay for 850,000 in the previous example for redecoration costs, and we find it's 980,000, we can't get a cheaper quote, well, one of our conditions might say that if the quote varies by more than 10 or 15% from what we provided for, that it needs to go back to that. So give the trustees the authority in those conditions when the plan is adopted. Otherwise, the plan is pointless if the trustees are simply spending what they like. There's a purpose for having those rand values there.
Why can't you just raise a special levy for the difference?
So if you raise a special levy, you can, but special contribution would need to still require either 30 days notice or in an emergency 7 days notice. But the whole intention, as we'll come back later with this, is not to be raising special contributions. They should be mostly for emergency purposes.
Yeah, but the trustees can raise a special levy anytime they want.
Trustees can, and should the trustees be having all that authority to raise at any time, or should the body corporate have that authority? What this plan is doing is it's giving the body corporate more authority than the trustees, because in the past, trustees have abused their authority. Would you agree? Okay. So that's why I'm looking at some of the scenarios so we can just apply our minds to it. Here's another one. A block of 10 units is ready to do a full redeck. 4 unit owners have already changed all of the windows to aluminium. Okay, the body corporate would have paid half, they paid half. One unit owner changed his wooden windows to mild steel instead of aluminium because it was cheaper than that. He did that unilaterally. The remaining 5 windows are wooden and in very bad shape. Repair to the wooden windows is at a cost of 16.5 and to the mild steel 2.1. The expenses are catered for in the MRR plan. What should one do in that particular case? Is it
Go ahead with the plan.
go ahead with the plan?
Resolution to the trustees.
Okay. So if it's been resolved, you go ahead with it. But these are things that should be discussed in terms of the scenarios to say, should we be recovering those because they haven't gone ahead with the aluminium? Is it fair to everybody else? Should they be paying an extra premium? So there are quite a lot of scenarios that need to be thought about in terms of the conditions to the MRR plan. Anybody else want to add to any of these 5 scenarios? You might not agree with me. I'm not a managing agent. I'm telling you what I understand from the legislation. Okay.
I think at the end of the day, it all comes to around what's reasonable.
Yeah.
The trustees have the capacity through the Act to raise a special levy in their full capacity. They don't have to go to the members to raise a special levy. They don't have to ask them.
Yeah.
It can be 5 million rand for a
Yeah.
special levy, and they're entitled to do that.
Cool.
But if the members have given them a directive that they can't do that through an AGM, then they can't do it. Then they have to go to a general meeting to do that. But it's at the end of the day, I think it's very subjective to each body corporate as how they manage their money. But as far as the Act goes, if a budget has been put in place and the members have accepted that budget, that 10-year maintenance plan at an AGM, then the trustees are allowed to go ahead with those kind of costs through their own resolutions for those type of repairs.
So prior to the 9th of October 2016, the normal annual budget would be approved. Now we've got the approval of the reserve fund and the MRR plan. And so there's a reason for that. The body corporate approves that. Whereas previously, as you're quite right, the trustees could raise a special levy of 5 million rand or so. The annual contributions are planned. And so those annual contributions is really what CSOS are wanting, to try and have preventative maintenance, plan for what you're going to expect. Special contributions, the trustees get to decide, and it's unexpected. One needs to be very careful, because the whole part of this legislation is to try and prevent the need for unnecessary special contributions. That's why we have the MRR plan and the reserve fund. And so if trustees are going to start raising 1 million or 2 million rand in special contributions and somebody complains, CSOS are going to come down hard. They're going to have to say, well, why have you not provided in terms of the legislation? And so that's really the point that I'm raising. They're 2 separate accounts, 2 separate books of accounts. And if it's reasonable that, yes, the costs are slightly higher than we planned, even if you used a planner, that would be fine. But this whole idea of special contributions is not what the Act intended. So what we've looked at now in terms of adoption is you need to do your homework first, adopt any improvements, determine what conditions there are to the plan, approve the amount that must go to the reserve fund immediately, and approve a plan at the general meeting by the simple majority. And so that takes you up to the adoption stage. Now we're talking about implementation. And again, I come back to what we've been talking about is the statutory requirement is designed to avoid somebody acting unreasonably, going too low. The body corporate needs to justify the budget that they've approved. And so that's why we have this. If you look at the legislation, it says that as far as reasonably possible, the need for special contributions, which have often been imposed, sorry, this wasn't the legislation, this was a note that I was making, have been onerous and have unexpected financial obligations on owners. And so you can think the CSOS is wearing the hat of all different types of schemes and thinking if somebody buys in and now suddenly they're faced with these special contributions and can't afford it, they're going to come back to the body corporate and say you haven't fulfilled your roles. Any comments on that? Okay. So then the other requirement is that the trustees must report the extent to which the approved maintenance, repair and replacement plan has been implemented to each annual general meeting. So if you go back a couple of slides to my specific way that we lay out our plan, you would basically have a look and you'd see, all right, in terms of this, have we spent that full amount? And in practice, what would you do in terms of implementing it is that annual general meeting is, okay, we have spent all of this, barring 5,000 Rand that's still in our administration fund, because you've transferred money from your reserve fund to your administration. We plan on spending 85,000 this year. We authorize you to transfer that 85,000 from the reserve fund to the administration fund for expenditure in the year ahead. And if it exceeds that, then it comes back to your conditions. What are your conditions of your MR plan? Can they exceed that? But then they, and be very specific if they can withdraw from the reserve fund or from the administration fund for the additional expenses. Okay. So another scenario, body corporates close to the coast, they've got 4 blocks of 20 units each. Each year the caretaker refurnishes the steel work on each block. His salary is 8,000 a month. It takes him a month to treat, and the materials cost around 12,000 a block, so it's 20,000 Rand to treat every year. It would cost the body corporate 350,000 to replace the existing railings with stainless steel. The MRR plan caters for maintenance only. What should the trustees do in a case like this if it comes to their knowledge? Don't they need to do anything? Is it up to them? I'm just interested in responses from the floor. It doesn't mean there's a right or wrong answer. Sure.
Sorry. If I was those trustees, I would go to the members, the general meeting, and put it to the members and say, we have this expense, this is what we need to do, we've got 3 quotes, there are, can we go ahead?
Yeah.
And if we got no money, then let's raise a special levy, and how we can raise a special levy.
Special resolution.
By special resolution.
Yeah, so special contributions should be a last resort, but it may be an opportunity to say at the next review of the plan, this is what we propose, because it makes more sense from a longer term perspective. And that is all the Act is really saying, is that the trustees need to apply their mind not to what we're going to spend this year, as budgets have always been for the next 12 months, and then raise special contributions on short notice. But rather, they need to think ahead. The next 10, 12 years, what is going to be the best investment, the best use of our money? And so maybe paying 20,000 every year is not the best if you actually do your present cost values, and stainless steel might last for 35 years. Let's plan to do that in the next 3 years, or whatever it may be. So the point is really just that as managing agents, I think you need to encourage the trustees to apply their minds to this issue of maintenance and not to be short-sighted. Even I know, because on our other business on the redecoration side, we might come with a product that's 400 micron thick in elastomeric coating, for example, and we know that the manufacturer will give a real 10-year guarantee on it, and we know that it could last 10 years, whereas the trustees will sometimes go for something that's cheaper, and it's only an 80 micron with two coats of paint, 80 micron, and they're going to have to repaint in 4 or 5 years. Well, have they applied their mind to whether it's worth spending another 60 or 70,000 now, because they don't need to paint within 10 years again? So that's quite important. And as managing agents, you're not expected to be experts, neither are the trustees expected to be experts in all these fields. But it's important that they have somebody involved that can give them the options. And if you need to call consultants in, do that, because I think CSOS are going to become a bit more serious. At the moment, they're dealing with a lot of disputes, and I don't know how many are related to this type of matter. But they seem to be quite effective on the dispute resolution side, not so effective on the administration side, especially in Cape Town. The Ombud, I think, is doing quite well there. And so, so the point is, how much do we spend on the MRR in the last financial year? When you have your review, how much do you intend to spend this year when you have your review? Any new issues? Any improvements that need to be included in the plan? And now that's something that one can look at. So your improvement can move to something that's incorporated in the reserve fund. And then update the MRR plan to indicate expenses and escalations in costs. Now, again, we do that, but the Act requires that you update it. But we do that up front, so your escalations are built in terms of the smoothed levies. And then adopt at that meeting a resolution to transfer from the reserve fund to the administration fund to pursue expenses. And so I think the whole point of this is it's not just about legislation. There's definitely benefits of having planned, preventative, scheduled maintenance as opposed to just reacting to unplanned corrective maintenance. And the cost implications, you've probably seen many graphs, but unplanned maintenance tends to cost a lot more than if you're planning your maintenance in proper intervals. It's going to cost you less. Take steel. You'll know that if you treat that every 3 years, it's going to cost you less than waiting for it to corrode and you've got to get somebody else there in to weld or to eventually replace. So all of these factors need to be taken into account, and trustees really need to apply their minds to it if they're going to do it themselves. And hopefully the inspector or whoever you use for your MRR plan applies their mind in a similar manner. So just to end a little bit, our mission there is really just to support and simplify the process of maintenance and repair for community schemes. That's why we've got the different sections. When we do a plan, we will also provide you with a quote from Super Seal, which will be valid normally for 24 months if your redeck happens within those 24 months. And then I've set up the Painting and Decorating Association very recently. It's free for any contractor to join. I have approached 3 or 4 contractors. So they've got their opinions, but my vision is that the UK, Australia, America, they all have painting and decorating associations, and there's certain standards that need to be adhered to. And so my reason for setting up this is with the support of manufacturers and SAPMA is that we'll set up certain standards, and if there are any disputes, you go back at the moment, you can visit the website. There are 24 standards there. That is an adoption from all 3 of those continents that we've put into South African practice. And if there's a dispute, you can go back to the standard and say, was it applied or wasn't it applied? And so that's very briefly what we about as Torox, as PMR22. Any questions?
How enforceable are 10-year guarantees provided by decorators and painters?
Okay, so every manufacturer has different guarantees or warranties. They call them guarantees, but they're actually, in my opinion, warranties, and most of them have a diminishing value on it. So it will start on what the cost of the paint is today. Some will take into current cost and they will depreciate over time. So there are some manufacturers that their warranties are worth the paper they're written on, others not. It's always good to try and have a joint warranty. So you've got a workmanship warranty with the applicator, and you've got a guarantee on the product with the manufacturer. And let's be honest, 10-year guarantees are, the trustees will have changed. So have reasonable guarantees that are enforceable. So if it's a 5 or 6 year, read through those terms and conditions and make sure they're enforceable. While there are 10 and 12 year products out there, if you read the fine print, those guarantees don't mean much after 12 years.
That's my point.
Yeah. No, you're quite right. But that's why this association is important, because let's be honest, and I know there's a lot of my competitors in the room here, but there is a lot of smoke and mirrors in the industry, and it's important to just have everybody on the same page. So that are cracks covered in your warranty or aren't cracks covered in your warranty? What are the standards so that we're all clear about it? If I look in the sunlight and I can see that this is patchy, but you tell me it's 2 coats, is that acceptable, isn't it? Surely there must be a minimum standard for it. So that's the idea of the thinking behind it, so that we can just elevate the ethics and the level of quality in the industry. And again, you're welcome to visit any of those websites. Any other questions? Come all from this side anyone from this side of the room? Okay. Thanks very much for listening to me.